You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian ghetto. It's my pleasure to welcome today. I have Josh Abbotoy and Ron Dodson here. I'm Kryptos, and we are hoping to have Black Horse join us a little later, but we're here today to talk about the phenomenon of the regime Christian, or as C.J. Engel has labeled them, the Regimevangelical. And broadly, this is a phenomenon where people are noticing that Christian leaders in the Protestant churches, who up until very, very recently were considered stalwart defenders of conservatism, who were considered traditional, suddenly, in the light of recent events, say probably post-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID, suddenly seem to sound a lot more suspect. And people are beginning to wonder about the kind of things that they're saying. They are policing the conservative or right wing of the church. They're terrified, it seems, about politics. And it also seems like many of them are angling towards accommodation with the broader regime thinking and the sexual revolution, the cultural revolution, the homosexual agenda, but also diversity, equity, and inclusion. And many of us are noticing that this is happening, and they are, I don't know if running scared, but they're defensive about it. And we are pointing it out. And I think a lot of our audience are just kind of waking up to the fact that a number of us have been aware of for probably several years now. It's starting to come to the fore with recent things. I wrote a piece on Friday about this, sort of with some of my thoughts on it, but I thought that I would invite some guys from the Ghetto on, and we could talk about this phenomenon of the Regimevangelical and have a conversation about, what do we think is happening? So anyways, Josh, Ron, welcome. Did any of you want to take it to maybe have a crack at it to begin with?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having us on here. It's good to it's good to be here. What I think broadly has happened, I think we probably need to maybe for some define the regime just right off the top.
Sure.
The regime is much more than governmental actors. I think most people know this, but it's a set of institutions that includes a lot of civic society, charitable foundations, educational institutions. It's a thick economy that is dedicated to certain shared premises. And, the primary one, I think, is sort of inherently leftist premises around egalitarianism and also the desirability of emancipating people from all unchosen bonds. And so that's it at a high level. And I think the problem of the Regimevangelical is at some point in the last 10 years, the regime, so to speak, decided to become less hospitable to dissenting viewpoints, right? And this maps onto what you might call Aaron Renn's negative world thesis, which is that at some point in the last 10 years, being a Christian, having the historic commitments that go along with being a Christian, became a negative socially. It brought a social cost with it. But at some point, Brandon Ike was fired from Mozilla. We passed Obergefell, and Justice Kennedy said that believing in traditional marriage was driven by animus, irrational hatred. At some point, these institutions decided we're not going to be hospitable to Christians anymore. But this poses a problem because a lot of evangelical institutions depend upon an economy that includes regime-aligned actors. So you depend upon charitable grants from the Lilly Foundation. You depend upon federal funding for your higher ed institution. Go on down the list. And so these actors, I think, have a lot of vested interest in trying to maintain some sort of respectability with the regime, even during a time when the regime is taking a very hard turn against Christian principles. And so I think what you see then is you see incentives to significantly downplay any portion of Christianity where Christianity is out of alignment with regime priorities. And then on the flip side, you will see them bend over backwards to Christianize any regime priority that could even colorably be considered a Christian commitment. So, for example, you've seen this rash of creation care study centers popping up at Christian universities and various public intellectuals endorsing them. This is just baptized environmentalism, right? And it's funded by the Open Society Foundation and similar foundations. You see something similar with the Immigration Evangelical Roundtable, same funding issues there. And then certainly in COVID, the evangelical leaders realized we can make ourselves useful to the regime by being an outlet for the regime's propaganda to evangelicals. We can find a way to baptize the absolute necessity of getting the vax in Christian language. So the regime evangelicals are a class of people who have a vested interest in keeping good relations with the regime. And sadly, they have increasingly incentives to make themselves useful to the regime, but it's starting to cut against the interests of the church, and that's becoming more clear.
Very well.
Did you want to add anything, Ron?
Well, I come at it from just a 30,000 foot level, and I think the Protestant project, especially the conservative or evangelical side, is a prophetic movement. It is generally useless unless it is preaching both to itself and to the wider church of it's never going to be a majority movement, except maybe in the United States, but let's see how that plays out. But it is a prophetic movement saying, remember. And prophetic movements are profoundly unpopular, and you either have to be okay with that or not. And the prophets were hated and castigated. This was a huge theme of Christ's ministry, that you hated the prophets, and the regime is functionally Sadducean in structure and belief. It is syncretist. It is following every incentive, and we can get into all the stuff as to why that is. I don't think we're here to talk about biblical history, but that's where I see this coming from. Is evangelicalism properly understood as a prophetic movement of calling to faithfulness, both to the word and to a certain amount to piety. And these things are always going to be vying for loyalty with the state and honestly with certain aspects of the family for loyalty. I think Aaron McIntyre has spoken about this very, very cogently. So that's kind of where I come from on this. So the regime evangelicals are really a Sadducean movement. If that makes sense to you guys.
Yes, it does. The way that I approached it is I came at it from the look of helping people understand sort of the nature of power politics, that there's two dynamics. One is very, very old force in politics, which is protection and obedience. So the one that protects you is the one that you have to obey. And the other is that ideas tend to bend themselves to power. And the recognition of that, say, in the American system, the acknowledgement of that, if people are denying, we have the free, free market of ideas and the free exchange, and this is sort of what we're built on. And, thinkers have said, well, poppycock, because you have a secret vote. When you go into the ballot box, everybody knows that if you want to be free from pressure, you have to do it in secret. And you have to have your vote hidden, because if it's out in the open and your ideas and who you're going to vote for out in the open becomes subject to external pressure and pressures from power. So those two dynamics, the one who protects you is the one that you obey. And then this notion of ideas bending to power. So you kind of look at it, and, America is a unique phenomenon in the sense that there is a significant portion of people that came during the colonial period for the set purpose of establishing their own ability to worship the way they wanted to worship. And that is one of those elements that's thrown into the mix as the colonies move from, the individual colonies through the revolution into a collective state that covers the broader 13 colonies. Is that part of that is part of this, what gets built is an expression of that desire to worship the way that they want to worship. And that's enshrined, in the Constitution and in the institutions that way. And when the state is very much aligned with the general character and purpose of the population, then it makes sense in some ways for the churches or the community of God outside, broader than the institutional church, for the community of believers to, in a sense, farm out what you might call that protection role to the state, because you don't feel threatened by it. So now the American state can protect your ability to worship freely. But then you begin to move forward in history. And as the state, following Reconstruction into the 20th century, both world wars, and then, you have the New Deal and so forth. By the time you emerge from the end of the Second World War, you can already argue that you're in a neutral to hostile condition already for the churches. Anyways, even culturally, you have, the immodesty of, bikinis on the beach, even just, rock and roll, all this kind of stuff that comes along in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You go back and look at like movies from the 40s, right? Every other parent is divorced. All the, there's like one of my favorite movies of all time, Miracle on 34th Street, right after the war. But this is a movie, it's about a single mom. So already this kind of cultural pressure is being put onto us. And now the protection obedience dynamic changes. And I think the American churches will have to reckon with the fact, before you get to that 10-year ago period, which I think is to say, 2010 is probably the decisive marker. But even before that, the churches were already accommodating themselves to power in ways that, were not really perceptible. Like you were talking about, how many American Christians are very much libertarian in their mindset, but if you go to scripture's not terribly libertarian, like not at all. And so there was, and laissez-faire economics, to be a free market guy and a capitalist is almost equivalent with being a Christian. So I think that there is a number of accommodations that Christians in the pews, general people are thinking, we have to recognize that this is not a new phenomenon. It's just now changing. So the old accommodations that we were comfortable with are no longer enough to protect you in an environment where the state is hostile now to Christians as you move. So the old accommodations worked in a friendly to neutral period, and that kept you safe. But now in this new hostile thing, we as Christians have to make a choice. Either you're going to accommodate yourself fully, and for many of like Josh was outlining, all the financial incentives are there and right. Very real. So right. You will continue to see that accommodation happening, or the churches are going to have to make a decisive break and say that, and this is maybe the question, is that we have to think of ourselves more as a church first than Americans first.
Well,
and maybe that's a crude way to put it, but I think that sort of maybe draws the lines very boldly.
No, I think you're really jumping on the tightrope that's being walked, and I think this is the same dynamic that Jeremy Carl is dealing with right now in the book on his book on the discrimination against whites, and it's why sometimes these two issues get conflated, because the mechanics are very similar. You have a people, one defined by ethnicity, let's call it, and another defined by creed, and both are now, because of top-down hostility, being forced to identify as a people, whereas before it wasn't a concern. It was like, what is water? The famous David Foster Wallace speech. It was just we existed because the top-down environment was either positive or neutral. And so you're seeing these two not congruent, Let's make that, or at least from my perspective, not congruent. I'm in no way an identitarian. But these two groups now suddenly having to identify as a people distinct from the regime, the ruling class, whatever you want to call it, and having to think of themselves as political agents, again, distinct from that construct. I'd love to hear Josh talk about that.
Yeah. Well, this is part of the reason why I wanted to have CJ on here, because he's really good on some of these issues. But yeah, go ahead, Josh.
CJ will be great when he gets on, but
yeah, no, not.
But
Josh
is great on
this.
So,
but yeah. But anyways, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I think one of the key pivotal moments in this development was sort of the late Bush years and the transition into the Obama years. So you know, and I was very much of this generation, right? But 2004 represented sort of this apogee of collaboration between the religious right and the GOP in America. So, you know, you know, you talk about free markets or libertarianism as a potential accommodation. I think maybe one of the greatest accommodations was the hawkishness that Christians adopted during the Bush administration. You know, we were
GWAT.
Yeah, we really adopted as a goal, like this idea of making the world safe for democracy. And I think, you know, in some ways even conflated the neocon global aspiration with the spread of the gospel. So that, you know, we have that apogee during that time, but already a lot of people see that very transparently. And, you know, of course, that was in a lot of ways, a lot of trends started during the Bush administration that have been catastrophic for our country to today. And then you have, you know, in 2008, you've got this new generation, this aspirational, just unbelievable political talent in Barack Obama, soundly defeats McCain, wins a lot of states that were like reliably red. Young people, the polling is just a bloodbath. They're all going Democrat. We have leaky borders and the immigrants are all going Democrat. And we start to believe that demographics are destiny. And all of those conditions came together to put, I think, just tremendous pressure on Christian leaders to find a way to make themselves, to accommodate themselves to this new hegemonic, you know, progressive regime that people thought was going to sort of permanently be in power. And so you can see this illustrated really clearly, actually, in the Southern Baptist world in the transition between the old leader of the ERLC, that's our think tank and public policy shop, Richard Land, you know, longtime close friends with the Bush family here in Texas, very educated man, you know, has a PhD from Oxford, but really used the ERLC as sort of a get out the vote, support the Republican platform outlet in the SBC's life. You transition from him to Russell Moore. And Russell Moore is sort of famously came up a Democrat, you know, at first has some interesting critiques even of sort of the marriage between Southern Baptists and the GOP during the Bush era, but very quickly, you know, moves beyond that into sort of trying to entirely depoliticize the SBC and sort of take it away from any kind of political or public policy relevance. And we all know, you know, Russell Moore's trajectory since then, you know, obviously found he could get national platforms anytime he wanted if he was willing to go on a MSNBC and demean his constituency. So he sort of got famous for talking about Trump voters as being white supremacists. He found he got a lot of purchase if he was willing to say that publicly, and ultimately parlayed that into his current role, which is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Which, by the way, Christianity Today is the flagship Regimevangelical outlet. That everybody, when we talk about Regimevangelicals, Christianity Today is middle of the fairway. That's what we mean. The posture that magazine has taken. In any event, you know, what's happened and become clear in the intervening years is it's just literally impossible if you want to maintain any semblance of Christian commitment. It is literally impossible to make you yourself or your institution palatable to the regime.
Welcome, Nate. You've just jumped in the middle here. Did you want to add something or just wait for a second before responding?
I'll wait a second. I only heard the second half of Josh's comment, so
yeah, that's good. This to me, I think, and part of the challenge that so many will have, I think, is because Christians have farmed out their political consciousness, that their consciousness of themselves as a people, that has been, given over to the American regime, like the state apparatus, but also to the idea of America. And the two things are very, very tangled up together. This sense of, what does it mean for me to be an American? What is my relationship with the American state? And what does it mean for me to be a Christian? And I know, coming because, I'm a Canadian, and, I grew up in a small, ethnically distinct Reformed community that worked very, very hard to have a self-conscious identity separate from the broader population, while not being like hostile to it. Appreciating the space that Canada gave us after World War II to have a future and those types of things, but still recognizing that we had to keep a separate identity. And so there's oftentimes coming at it as, somebody then who went and spent his 20s in the States studying, for me, has always stood out as an outsider, the degree to which American Christians have found their identity as much in being a Christian as in being an American. And the two are very much tangled. So when you have this idea that the state is hostile to the Christian community and your leadership in seeking the rewards of the state is corrupting the church, a lot of times I think they're like deer caught in the headlights, because they don't know how to untangle all that complex of feelings that they have for the idea of the nation, the idea of the church. And, can I love both of them? Can I still be a proud and dutiful American when my state is trying to crush me and to pervert what I believe? And I think a lot of these questions get tangled up together, even as we stand as deer in the headlights, watching our leadership doing just that very thing.
Well, you have this. Sorry, go ahead, Nate.
No, go ahead, Ron.
Well, I was just going to say, you have this. I was visiting with the guy we all know just this weekend about the uniquely American trait of outgroup preferencing that is somehow in America, it is seen as Christian to prefer to have these outgroup preferences, that somehow is demonstration of God's love. And it's I think that's tangled up in some of the dynamic here, especially on the moderate to liberal side of the American church. So anyway, that's all I had to say on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
So I think this is certainly interesting. I think my sense was Josh touched on some of that just based on the second half of what I saw. There's a very, very strong sense in which you touched on in your essay, in which American Christians sacralize parts of the Constitution. I think what I wrestled with, which is an interesting question, is to the extent that Christians are coming up with a political settlement, to the extent that they're choosing to be part of a polity, it's reasonable to emphasize aspects of Christian ethics that align with the ethics of that political community. So to the extent that America was offering that protection bargain to Christians, it's not unreasonable for Christians to in exchange emphasize aspects of Christianity that support that. I think that seems like a natural part of helping contribute to the civic religion. I don't have firm views on this, but the question is, can you do that without dogmatizing that, without actually reshaping your dogma to reflect the Constitution, subordinate to the Constitution? It almost feels like in many ways a lot of the Christians we deal with on the other side of a lot of these debates have actually they've actually conformed their Christianity to the Constitution rather than accepting some sort of synthesis in terms of emphasis. Those people we need to decouple. If we create a new parallel polity, we do need to, we don't need to do that. And this is jumping into sort of the later, a new political consciousness. We don't need to do that, although we may need to do analogous things that include emphasizing aspects of Christianity that aren't just sort of pure Christian ethics, but are politically convenient to what a dissident movement would need today. So I think that sort of identity is what's interesting is that identity has been entangled. Do we almost need to move in the opposite direction to disentangle it? Do we need to emphasize aspects of Christianity that are actually distinct, precisely to sort of provide a meaningful counter? Or can we actually bridge those by developing a separate political consciousness while maintaining the sort of, relatively American characteristics that American Christianity has developed that actually align with the American, with sort of American values? That's a tough question. Like, will a politically independent American Christianity look more or less like American Christianity has?
It's an interesting thing because it comes down to this question of, maybe like three pieces, right? So there's the broader American culture and ethos, which has been, there's no denying that it has been shaped by, the deep religiosity of, general America until very recently was a broadly Christian society. I think, weekly church attendance was in the 50% mark, when in my childhood. So that's one aspect. Then you have the state, which is another piece. And then you have the Christian community, distinct from the broader American populace, general. So, how those three pieces relate, but it is undeniable that the state is hostile to the Christian community. And where does that leave Christians' relationship to the broader American culture? I think, like you say, Nate, is still indeterminate. But I do think that if Christians can no longer rely on the state for protection, that breaks that sort of protection obedience binary. And so if you're still going to rely on the state to protect you and your ability to worship freely the way you choose, you're going to have to adapt to the state and adapt your faith to the state in order to do that. But if you don't wish to do that, then you're going to have the choices that you have to disentangle yourself and establish your own political identity. And you have to protect yourself. And that, I think, is in some ways that raises all kinds of questions then, do you go the route of martyrdom? Do some raise up to stand and say, no, we're going to stand in the breach and protect our fellow believers? And these are a lot of questions down the road that get raised to the fore as soon as you raise the question of a politically conscious Christianity.
It's that's a good question. I think it's, and then I guess to some extent, it could be a question of if we do have to create a politically conscious Christianity, maybe it's a question of statesmanship, fundamentally. What emphasis, what sort of, you could think of it as sort of a theological, ethical emphasis is most conducive for that Christian political group? Is it one? There's a case to be made from a statesmanship perspective that it should continue to align with the historic American tradition and some of those emphases, because that's going to be more effective at winning over American Christians. And you can make the case that it's going to strategically depart in intentional and provocative ways from that to help emphasize the break needed to create a new political consciousness. And I guess the point is, it sounds like you would agree that that's largely a question.
Oh, yeah.
relationship rather than one of necessarily one that can be theologically determined.
Well,
there
this
is
correct, right? In order,
so welcome, Black Horse.
In order to have non-regime Christianity, you have to have a layer of political leadership to the community, which is not the same as the layer of or at least generally is not the same as the layer of ecclesiastical leadership. And it has concerns that are not theological concerns.
Yes.
And so at present in Western countries, this layer does not exist because historically there was no distinction between the political consciousness of the state and the political consciousness of the Christian subpopulation. But if you look at places where Christians have lived under hostile regimes for a very long time, this layer is everywhere. So if you look all through like the history of the Ottoman Empire, there's this layer of political representation for the Christian subcommunity that lives in XYZ province of the Ottoman Empire. This is true to the Arab world, where Arab Christians have lived under hostile regimes for a very, very long time. It's true a whole number of places. You can make the argument that when Mormons lived as a political minority in the United States, they had the same kind of thing where they had a layer of leadership of their own communities, which politically represented themselves in interface to the U.S. government or to the government of the state in which they were inhabiting. And the construction of that layer is not really a theological question. It's a lowercase p political question, and it has all of the problems that go with that.
Yeah, I think this is exactly right, guys. I mean, I think that just to push it a little further, I would say this layer is emerging right now. And it's emerging for a couple of different reasons. But one, I mean, the regime has significantly overplayed its hand and taken stances that do not resonate with a large minority, at a minimum, of the American population. So we all know that there's a secular trend toward reinvigorated federalism. What is actually happening there is a devolution of sovereignty from the federal government to states in our system. Ron DeSantis is an early harbinger of this development, but it's actually resulted in some very weird. It's resulted in some sort of weird results where, I'll go to higher education as an example. In some ways, there's more intellectual freedom to be right wing at a public university in Florida today than there is at a mainstream evangelical educational institution. So the opportunity, and I think it's actually there right now, is for evangelical leaders to actually align themselves in a way that syncs up with reinvigorated federalism, and this will require some greater flexibility with regard to the Constitution. But I'm also maybe a little bit more sanguine about the fact that this is not. It doesn't actually have to be cast as a rejection of the Constitution. The American tradition has this long history of the use of departmentalism, which is basically the idea that 9 judges, the 9 robed ones, are not the infallible arbiters of what the Constitution means, but rather what the Constitution means is something that has to be determined by every office holder who's taken an oath of fidelity to the Constitution. We all know at crucial points in American history, presidents have stepped in and disregarded the Supreme Court at certain times. And so this is, this sort of, as the federal government is just having a harder time wielding power, I think we're likely to see a resurgence of departmentalism, particularly along the federal axis. So we're going to see more state level assertions, in states of exception. This is arguably what's happening at the border with Greg Abbott down here in Texas. And along with that, there's an opportunity, I think, an inevitability that evangelicals are going to start aligning with state level governance layers.
Well, and this, I think, is a good way. And I think you're absolutely right, Josh. And it's a good way to dovetail into some of Nate's concerns of, sort of the overlapping and intertwined, and, does the governance have to be, something specifically Christian that, emerges from the Christian community. And if we look to, so Calvin late in the second volume of the Institutes in book 4, chapters, I think we're chapter 20, subsection 30 and so forth. He's talking about in these later sections of the Institutes about a Christian's relationship to government. And, the scriptural injunctions are very clear that the king and your rulers, I know we live in a democracy and it's supposed to be the will of the people and so forth, but from a Christian perspective, your rulers are placed there by God. And so even a unjust king, an evil king, deserves your obedience because they are responsible to God and they're placed there by God. And it's really the king is going to have to be the one that faces judgment on the final day. So there is that layer. And yet at the same time,
extremely low time preference there. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that like this kind of, let's have a look at the American context here. So where you've got there's no localized location that I can think of in the United States, certainly not at the level of a state, where any effort at governance attempted by evangelical Christians is going to involve them not governing a substantial minority of people who are adherents to the progressive religion or just secular people or whatever else. So you're going to have, if you operate through the kind of political vehicles that exist already, you're going to be in a situation where you're asking a layer of statesmen to govern not just your own community, but also the other communities which share geography with you.
That's right.
This is a very strange property of the United States where people who have, very different, who don't belong to the same community live as next door neighbors, right? I bet you if Ron went down his street, he could find people that are all their relationships are tied up with some other community, not his church, right? Whereas historically, most of the literature we have about how to do Christian parallel politics comes from a world where you've got a geographic pocket, which is like 95% homogeneously Christian. And then you've got some other pocket, which is not homogeneously Christian.
This is downstream effects of CRA, but that's a different topic.
But that's where we are today, right?
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
Any attempt to create Christian polity is going to have to be an attempt which looks at the role of the role of the Christian statesman as governing not only his own community, but the other communities which share geography with him, which is kind of a unique historical challenge.
It is. But it's also, in a sense, I think, as one of the things that Christians have to realize, especially if we're looking to say, okay, we're as a Christian community and we're developing a political consciousness that's separate from the national regime, and we're targeting our local communities and local areas as places where we can develop a political consciousness that is uniquely and faithfully Christian, but doing so without necessarily reinventing all of the offices and institutions that are there. There is that provision at the end of Calvin's Institutes where he talks about the obligation that the lower magistrate has to defend his people from the oppressions of the higher magistrate. And I think that's in some ways probably the best way for us as a Christian community to look at it, in the sense of, even where, like as Black Horse was saying, we're never going to probably be in a situation where we're creating small Christian ethno-states, that we have to recognize, even when we're a significant minority or a small majority, that these are no longer homogeneous communities. And in some ways that was by design. This breakdown of the social fabric was by design to encourage society at scale. And so as we relocalize it, and as we emerge with a political consciousness, we have to understand that our people have to understand that once they're stepping into that role, part of that role as a minor magistrate means you are creating your role as a protector to create space for your people to worship God in a way that is consistent with their belief and that where they don't have to compromise.
Yeah,
and that's, I think, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, that's absolutely correct. However, I would say that I look at it a little bit differently. To me, the choice is between Christians pursuing statesmanship through traditional vehicles, which are geographically centric, and Christian subpopulations pursuing politics through non-traditional channels. So, like, if you look at the United States, well, U.S. politics is maybe a little bit less like this. But if you look at politics in any European country today, you will see politicians bending over backwards to placate specific communities because those specific communities organize how they vote along ethnic lines and have very good community discipline to get their priorities addressed by people who are in leadership over the broader community. And so you have two very different approaches. One is to go ahead and directly capture existing formal political leadership, and the other is to create a layer of leadership on top of your community that enforces political discipline that helps your community's political needs get addressed by people in official positions of power who have to reckon with that layer, right? It's the Amish model versus it's the Christian nationalist model. And to me, that's the crossroads that we're at. And in either case, you need a set of institutions that are prepared for either of those two worlds instead of prepared for the world where instead of prepared for the world that existed 70 years ago.
Well, yeah. Of course, in first century biblical terms, you're talking about the Essenes versus the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And part of the problem of making the Pharisees the devils is we miss out on the good things that, at least in their Genesis, they were trying to do. So, and that's a particular evangelical problem, is we conflate, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but we conflate Judaizer and Pharisee, and so our political understanding is confused as well.
Yeah, well, I would suggest when Paul instructs the people not to go in front of the secular courts, but instead take their lawsuit in front of the church and judge among themselves, he's describing a situation where there's a strong layer of essentially political leadership.
That's a political consciousness.
At the community level.
It absolutely is.
And in that circumstance, Christians controlled 0% of Roman governance, right? And so there's two possible paths forward. There's the path that Josh has quite eloquently outlined, where you attempt to find a place where you're, a sufficient minority or small majority, capture the official political layer and operate from there, and operate with the political layer as your base of operations. And then there's the layer where you have no hope of doing that for one reason or another. Maybe you're a Christian in California or something, and now you have to operate differently.
That's true. Now this is interesting because we've kind of gone down a bit sort of the theory, painting out a picture of what what it might look like once we get to a politically conscious Christianity, and that's valuable. But right now, today, we are confronted with a Christian leadership that is in many ways actively looking to sell the church out to the regime for protection. So the question, I guess, that we face with in the next few years is how do we prevent this? How do we untangle? What are the kind of steps that we can begin to take or advocate for in our own house to stem the tide of what we've been watching happening up to now? Because we're looking at it, and I think for most of us looking and say, this is really concerning. If we keep going down this path, this is going to be bad. We're going to be the mainline denominations all over again. So, do we want to go through more church splits or whatever? Is it possible for us to do this? I know it's unfortunate that John couldn't be here, because I know he's been very active in talking about the upcoming Southern Baptist Convention and some of the things that they're looking to do to stem this tide. But are there concrete things, and maybe Josh could speak to this, because you're the most familiar with this, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I would say I don't think it's even just possible to stem this tide. I think there's a at scale elite failure in evangelical institutions, and I think it's actually an inevitability, or close to an inevitability, that that's going to get reshuffled. Hopefully, the way that it gets reshuffled is that these large institutions can stay together and stay legitimate, and we get people who know what time it is at the helm. And I think that's likely, and we're trying to, we should all be seeking ways to hasten that process, I think. But, the absurdity, there's so many examples of just this betrayal where these elites are so out of step with their constituencies, it really undermines even their ability to lead their institutions. I mean, the best example, again, is like, how do you get to a world where a Russell Moore, who's purportedly the public policy mouthpiece for the Southern Baptist Convention, goes on cable news and says that Trump voters are white supremacists, even when 90% plus of his own constituency is Trump voters? That's an absurd situation. It's not stable. It will resolve one way or another. And I think most likely it resolves in the current leadership class being obsolesced. I think they're going to be those who've staked out hard pro-regime positions are going to find it untenable increasingly to maintain their leadership roles in these institutions, and there will be a reset of the leadership class. What's happening in the SBC is interesting. I mean, there's a grassroots swell to push the convention to have clarity around whether or not egalitarian churches can even sort of remain part of the membership. And there's some nuances I won't get into there, but the battle lines over that debate fall along predictable lines. Some of the larger pastors, sort of purported SBC elites, oppose the efforts, but the grassroots, and I would say a new faction of sort of dissident elites, are pushing for clarity within the Southern Baptist Convention to basically articulate very clearly that, an egalitarian church cannot be a member. And the results of that, it's an important issue in and of itself, but it's also an important wedge that tends to correlate with a lot of other views that go along with egalitarianism. And it's actually up for a vote in a week and a half. So prayers are appreciated in all of this. If anybody's listening who's Southern Baptist, get yourself to the convention and vote. But we may finally ratify their steps that draw a very hard line against egalitarianism, and that's going to be a huge deal. The Southern Baptist Convention has about 14 million people in it, the largest Protestant denomination in America, the only mainline that's still sort of orthodox, small o orthodox. That will reverberate throughout American Christianity if that happens in a week and a half. So, I'm actually pretty optimistic. I see rising generations both inside the institutions and then externally, critics, prophetic voices who are ready to. I think they know what time it is, they know what the game is, and they're ready to do the work to wrest these institutions back.
Now, the institute. Now, to be clear, especially for the listener, the institutions are not just simply like the church and churches, and then the governing structures with the churches, but there's almost a whole industry of parachurch and ancillary. It goes down as far as companies that will sell, back office management services for Christian ministries. Yeah. It's quite surprising the amount of ministry or parachurch ministries and the complex of it. But that was one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Josh, is the way that these ministries get tied into government funding and then feel the pressure of government policy setting, that basically they become, you have organizations that the label says that they're Christian and part of the broader, even conservative church thing, but functionally they're wholly owned by the government.
Well, and this comes down to what I think is the key question for getting from here to renewed institutions. How do you change the incentive structure for the elites who are operating these institutions? So right now we've got one method being applied, which is apply pressure from the grassroots on the elites running these institutions to move them in the direction we'd like to see them go. On the other side, you have, to varying extents, financial incentives being applied to these elites to move them away from the direction that we would like to see them go. I think it's a fascinating question. What mechanisms are available to us to alter the incentive structure here?
I think we can significantly up our game as watchdogs on these institutions. I think you see elite, like sort of dissident elite factions forming. And right now the dynamic is they're a little bit like barbarians outside of the gates.
Yeah.
But I think it's only a matter of time before they break through, because again, I think we have by and large, we've got the people with us. We've got the grassroots. And so, 10 years ago, people saw this, but most of the people doing work in this front were the class of commentators known as discernment bloggers. Yeah. These are people, great people. John kind of cut his teeth doing this to some degree, right? John Harris, like an outside critic, people with very little institutional power. They're pointing out issues that was indispensable. I think that a lot of this concern is reaching sort of a second generation, one where there's just there's more people saying it now. And then two, you're actually seeing, I think, elites inside of these institutions looking at the future and saying, man, like, this is not a sustainable trajectory. If we don't actually hit the reset button and align ourselves with our own people and also understand the times better, these institutions may not survive. Because it's very well known now that although the incentives at the top are trying to get you to betray your constituency, it might be personally good for you in a limited way, but then you kill the golden goose. I mean, if you go egalitarian, your church will be collapsing like a mainline church in 20 years. And where does that leave you? So I think even younger people coming up in these Christian institutions, they have interests in actually helping to press the reset button as well.
It'll mean definitely, though, like to take, for example, immigration. Once you get into it and you realize the degree to which, like, we generally think of like, oh, the problem of immigration is a problem that the government just won't establish border controls and they won't deport or whatever. But when you look into the number of, like, my own denomination, the same thing is that the number of, boards and governing structures and para agencies that receive government funds to settle immigrant families, they essentially become an arm of the state. And I'll bet you, if you look into like Southern Baptist, you pick any denomination of any size, they will have some sort of ministry for the compassionate dealing with of immigration, of refugees, or whatever term is used. And almost invariably, they will be taking some form of government money in terms of match funding or whatever, and they become basically a wholly owned arm of government immigration policy. And so, to disentangle it means, in some sense, then you have to be willing to cut off the financial and prestige tap for your churches and to say, just no, we refuse. And that, just the fact that you refuse funding, of course, will then put you on the regime radar as a target.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of this decoupling that needs to happen is so much broader than people realize. In the SBC, we have an asset manager that has about $20 billion under management. Yeah. And they give a lot of their assets to BlackRock right now. That's just one example.
It's unconscionable. It drives me crazy.
just go down the list. I mean,
I knew the guy who used to run that deal.
I mean, surely there's a Baptist who is in the asset management business. I mean, just speaking as an outsider, surely there's one.
No, there must be one. I seriously, and I don't want to name names because I kind of like some of these people, but they're boomers, and played golf with the guy who ran the main allocator for all this, and again, like you said, just absolutely zero difference in manager allocations than just the average multi-strat, wealth manager. Zero difference. It just blew my mind. And maybe being in that business, maybe I was especially sensitive to it, but, and I raised the question about understanding the political power in a positive sense for the that they had with that level of assets. And I mean, I was looked at like I had three heads,
Well, I mean, could you imagine new founding with the kind of funds that the SBC has available to it in terms of asset managing, the way that you could promote regime aligned businesses and startups?
I can imagine quite a lot. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, even like with the SBC scale, what I like to imagine is what would it look like for them to be working with red states to get behind a major. Red states have a problem too, where they can't find an aligned asset manager. And just to be fair to these guys, when you go to the market and look for quotes for somebody to manage a lot of money, BlackRock is often 30
highly competitive.
30, yeah, they're 20, 30 bips cheaper than a lot of their competitors, right? So, and then are you going to turn around and tell all these people who have a retirement that depends on you that, I'm sorry, I went to a fund with a much more expensive fee layer because of values. Like it's a real, there's some real sacrifice involved in making that move. But we need, just ultimately we need really good elites who have an aspiration to use their power like prudently with other big players and form, real alternative dissident elites.
And let's look at what the actual consequences to decoupling have looked like historically. So, for example, when the Quebec government decoupled from the Catholic Church in the 70s, what that looked like for the Catholic Church was like an 80 or 90% decline in financial assets over the following period, because the effective subsidy that they were getting for all the work that they were doing out of the government was very, very large compared to their asset profile. So when an actual decoupling like that occurs, there are going to be very substantial consequences to that are going to be hard to. I mean, you're gonna. It will require people who are not conservative in the sort of personality sense in order to take that on, because there's going to be you're going to have big losses on one side and big gains on the other. It's a dramatic kind of step, and it's not a step that's easy to take sort of one piece at a time.
No, but I think the you also have to tie in to say, hey, listen, your returns are not going to be high, but then you also have to have a vision for what are you going to do with the money? I mean, we talk a lot about, rebuilding manufacturing base, that our economy is all fake and that if you're going to have a real economy, it has to be built on actually making a producer's economy.
But again, and so who in leadership of the SBC knows anything about any of that?
And that's a part of the point, the Black Horse too, is that in a sense of, so I think that, again, we look at it, as soon as you begin talking about this now and start going down the rabbit hole, there are not just things, but there's real opportunities, because if you can then invest, you can build factories that then can employ young Christian men who can then have a stable income to form families. And, all of these things that you can then cast a vision for people, but it's beyond, this vision gets beyond just simply, well, we have to plant a church and spread the gospel and so forth. And you're thinking like, no, we're sitting on like a massive set of assets that we can use to rebuild not just churches, but a community of Christians as a functioning whole. And I think that this just sort of gets the conversation going, but a lot of it then begins with the process of saying we need to untangle ourselves from the power structures that we thought were protecting us, and we need to now begin to have a self-conscious understanding that we need to take care of our own and need to take care of our own affairs. And the degree that we can do that within this body of politics will do so, but otherwise we're going to go on our own.
So a couple things. First, there's 14 million Baptists. There are certainly Baptists who have the competency and mindset to be able to.
Of course, there is.
Yeah.
But I would say the two leaders in this regard have been, the Mormon Church. They've done some very interesting things, very interesting model of study. They have their own challenges, but in this regard, they've been very good. The other one is Catholic at the diocese level have been exerting leadership. One group I know is the Diocese of Fort Worth has brought all of their management largely internally. They're doing venture, they're doing real estate. They're thinking very strategically about their admittedly relatively modest endowment and how to use it to advance the goals of their church and not merely just maintain their wealth.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I know that all of you are busy. I really thank you for carving time out of the mid of your busy days. And I think what's exciting about this is, as every conversation that we have in this way, we're layering it with new pieces, internal, external, and we're building an understanding of what needs to happen going forward. And it's a very exciting time. And I think that we're going to continue to add to it going forward. And now we have something to talk about that we've began a conversation here. And I'm sure that we will pick it up again next time. So Ron, Josh, Nate, Black Horse, thank you for your time. And I wish you all well in your day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.